Hi, everyone. So it looks like go time. Can everyone hear me okay? Just kind of put your fingers up if you can hear me. Hi. Thanks for joining us on this rainy Wednesday. It's actually like raining and not raining and then raining again. But we're so happy that you all have taken time out of your evening to join us as we continue to admit others into the room. If you all want to take a moment and get familiar with the chat function, I'm sure a lot of you that have been in Zoom rooms are all too familiar with how this works, but we like to utilize this during our conversations, and also take some time to adjust your speaker view so you can view in gallery where you can see some of the faces of those of us who are online tonight, or you can adjust it to where you can see just the speaker. That is, of course, all up to you. You can rename yourself there on your screen by clicking on the top right. Those three dots in your screen will allow you to rename yourself. If you think that you may have some questions, you can go ahead and do that there. So if you all could just take a moment as we're continuing to let people into our Zoom room here and introduce yourselves in the chat bar. We're going to start out the conversation that way today. And I will start out by introducing myself as you're doing this. So thank you for joining us for part 3 in our series of courageous conversations about race. I'm your host, Kimberly Waller, and I am the founder of Women's Power League of Alaska. Women's Power League is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. We consist of a network of Alaskans united for the purpose of strengthening our state's economy through the empowerment of women. And we do that through mentorship, professional development, and community building. And this conversation falls under community building because we know that strong communities happen when people feel that their voice is heard and when they feel that they are in an equitable space. So this is all about community building. So I have asked you to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat bar. I'm just going to click back and see how you all are doing with that. It looks like everyone is introducing yourself, and I am not seeing anything in my chat bar. Maybe that's just my chat bar. Okay. Someone started there. Penny Gage just started us off. Thank you, Penny. Nice to see you on the call. We're continuing to let people into the room. So what I do want to say is we're doing that. Please take a moment to get familiar with those who are on the call, right? Because this has been a 3-part series. So for us, this has been an ongoing process, and I just have to take time and give it up to the individuals and to the organizations and to those who have long been doing this work in the state of Alaska in the area of race and equity. So Women's Power League is just joining into a chorus of conversations that we have seen taking place all across our state. And many of you have had some very tough conversations, right, in your home or within your friendships or within family members. And we want to acknowledge that and also say that you are free to speak your mind here, but please do that respectfully. We all come with our difference and with different points of view. And so Women's Power League, we sponsor a number of events and conversations that can be emotionally charged. And that's how it goes when we get together to talk about things that we care about. So please respect everyone's right to expression. And as an organization, we are intolerant of any hate speech. So lastly, again, thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your evening to join us for the conversation. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Alaska Humanities Forum, YWCA Alaska, GCI, and the 4-Acre Group. So with that, tonight we're going to start things off a little differently. Today many of us have heard and are learning of the verdict in regard to the Breonna Taylor case. And we're preparing for ongoing racial unrest in this country. If you turn on the news right now, you will see there are riots and demonstrations and an outpouring of expressions in the streets all across the country. And so I wanted to start this session by welcoming a poet, a radio personality, and friend by the name of Karina Delgado. She is a hometown success story, and many of us on the call are zooming in from other parts around the country. And Karina is zooming in from Washington, D.C., where she is a radio personality. So I would like to ask Karina to unmute herself and welcome her to the conversation. Karina, take it away. Are you there?
I'm here. Can everyone hear me? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Well, Kim, thank you so much for inviting me to share this poem with this group today. And as you mentioned, especially after the news today in Louisville. And I know that, as you said, we can continue to see more unrest in our nation. And it's such a difficult time, especially when a woman can be murdered in her own bed and there is no justice for her. And I think that one thing that needs to be considered as we prepare ourselves for the long road ahead is battle fatigue. And so we need to have that important conversation about rest when we know that that the road ahead is going to be long and hard. This poem that I wrote is my ode to allyship and the importance of rest during difficult times such as these. One of the ways that I view a movement is that it, and being an ally in that movement, is like a choir. And I think of the word rest, and I think of music and how there's actually multiple symbols for rest on sheet music because it is that important. And also viewing it as in a musical context as a choir. For those of us who want to be allies, it's important to know that as allies, we are background singers. We are a part of the choir, and we are the ones to hold the note so that the lead singers can breathe when they need to and be the front of that song. So that said, this is my poem, A Soldier Song for the Suffocated. I set forth to write a song for you, something that would see you through, keep faith afoot and perseverance in your lungs so that when you exhale during the difficult part of your journey, your labored breath would sound like hope and song. I dug deep to the natural rhythm of my feet and the sway in my hip, the nod of my head, the purse of my lips. Lyrics licked like envelopes. I had hoped to recount all of my downward slopes to find you the fuel and tools necessary to compose your song. But you've been singing so long. Spirituals, hymnals, and heartbreak anthems, a triathlon of songs panting, I will survive, and Lord, I'm coming. The repetitive humming creates this buzz, no more noticeable than the whir of our computers. Whereas once, a song could inspire nations to part seas, virgins to part knees, and the suffocated to breathe. But if you've been singing for survival every mile of the way, the melody starts to lose its taste. The overchewed cud of we shall overcome, it tends to wear away at the tongue. And I've sung so many songs of survival that my recant would no more than minimize your trial. My off-key, out of tune, is no redemption song for your doom. And soon I started to realize that singing you lovely lullabies was a far cry from what you needed. Composer defeated, I told myself retreat. And I finally found no shame in that. You see, once upon a time, we were soldiers. And we were sold this idea that retreat is delayed defeat, and that rest is for the wicked, and that a moment to cease and peace is only afforded to the weak. Speak nothing of war and worlds of warriors and rest in the same breath. Slave masters, emperors, and warlords spun such webs, and we tricked our souls with songs of salvation in order to fulfill unreal expectations. My ancestors said no retreat, no surrender. and they called it kamikaze. They had us killing ourselves, and they convinced us it was honor, like suicide bombers. Slaves, servants, Gentiles, Jews, the disenfranchised, and every child that struggles too. We see our way through, surviving only by the sound of our own song. But before you happily sing along, consider this. With regard to tyranny and the oppressed in the game of chess, it is solely the pawn which is required to move only forward. There are no symphonies here, no melodies that would trick the ear, no harmonies to harp the heart, tenor of thy tears, notes as sharp as spears, fallacy of falsetto. Allow your vibrato to settle, and for a moment, silence your song. Breathe, and I will sing along, holding the note so that you can inhale between the notes. And somehow, your exhale will still sound like hope. Thank you.
Karina, thank you so much. That was beautiful. And I know that it is getting late where you are on the East Coast in DC. And thank you for taking the time out of your evening to bless us, our conversation with that piece of poetry. And I wanted to quickly, before I move along to our first guest speaker, I wanted to, just ask if you had any thoughts in addition to that incredible piece that you wanted to impart to our guest here in Alaska. For those of you that don't know Karina Delgado, she is very much of a hometown success story, and we are cheering her on, and her rise in radio has been so incredible to watch. So Karina, did you have anything to add before I cut you loose to take a nap or do whatever you need to do?
Well, I just wanted to say that although things definitely seem very bleak right now, that there is still hope. And the fact that we are all coming together to have these difficult conversations and doing so from such a mindful space as we move forward into this weird new world. I just continue to believe that there is hope, not only, for this generation, but generations to come, because, even regardless of the outcome in November, even there's hope. There is hope, especially with our children. My son is 25 years old, and I can say of his generation and of millennials, they are ready for this fight. I've never seen a more quote unquote woke group of individuals. And, I was having this conversation with Kim earlier that, older generations often complain that millennials and younger are so entitled. That's always kind of like the label that's put on them, that they are entitled. They're an entitled group and an entitled generation. But we raise them that way to believe that in what they deserve, and for them to come to the table and ask for what they deserve. And I know that they also feel entitled to justice. They feel entitled to the liberty that was promised to them, and they are fighting for it. And I think that is incredibly hopeful.
Thank you, Karina. And I totally agree. When you speak with this younger generation, when you speak with the youth, which I've been doing a lot in recent weeks, and even just watching the actions of my little nieces who are there in Atlanta, my daughter is 4, and she has been to 5 peaceful demonstrations, a few here, a few in Boston, Massachusetts, where she was born. You can't help but think that we are kind of bringing up the next generation of young activists. And it is very encouraging to see the work that they are doing in the world. So I wish you the best, and your son is incredible, and much love to you. And with that, I want to keep the conversation moving. Karina, feel free to join us on the call. You've got lots of great comments on your contribution there in the chat bar, which I hope that you take the time to read. So with that, in our prior conversations about race, we've taken the opportunity to talk about our concerns, our fears, and our frustrations about race. So we started these conversations in the wake of George Floyd, and we talked about our overall experiences with race as individuals. And it was a heavy space. These conversations are posted online on our Facebook page at Women's Power League of Alaska.com, and we're in the process of building out our website so they can accommodate a lot of what we are doing, and you can check that out there. But you can see in that first conversation, it was a hard conversation for a lot of us to have because George Floyd was still very fresh, and it had been a much overdue conversation that kind of cracked our nation open. And we checked in with each other on that first call. And in the follow-up call, we talked about issues of race in our state and how they show themselves, not just in our communities, but in our neighborhoods and in policy and education. So for tonight's final conversation, we will pick up and we will continue talking about race in our nation. And from our interactions with each other, we will talk about the imagery that's perpetuated through mass media. And we'll also talk about how race presents itself at the ballot box. So conversations like these, in my opinion, I feel like they raise awareness. There's no right way to do that. And that's been my one biggest takeaway in leading these conversations, and with Women's Power League kind of stepping into this space. There's no right way to do it. But the thing about it is, and those of you on the line who have had these conversations in the privacy of your homes, or, with your colleagues or with your friends, you kind of just jump in there and do the work with the understanding that you may not say it right, or you may not express it just the way that you would like to express it, but that that it's important enough to act. And it's important enough to have that conversation, because at this point, not having the conversation is negligence. So these conversations raise awareness. They help us to identify blind spots. And as Karina said so beautifully, they encourage us at a time when many are growing weary with the ongoing racial unrest in the United States. Turn on the news right now, you can see it. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Ian Hartman. Dr. Hartman is a professor of history. He grew up in Western Pennsylvania. He completed his PhD at the University of Illinois in 2011 and has been at UAA since then. And his research and teaching, intersects broadly with political, cultural history in the United States since the Civil War. He is particularly interested in issues regarding power, wealth, and inequality, and he teaches history from the bottom up and stresses how regular people have changed the course of American history in ways both big and small. And for those who are interested, Dr. Hartman likes hiking, traveling. He likes talking politics or cheering on his beloved Steelers, Pirates, and Penguins. So with that, Dr. Hartman, I invite you to unmute yourself and welcome to the conversation. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that introduction. And thank you also for putting a little bit of space between Karina and I, so I didn't have to go right after that just incredibly stirring and beautiful poem and performance. It was really touching. So yeah, thank you so much for this invitation. What I figured I would do a little bit with this time is I think I'll just do a little bit of kind of history and toggle back and forth between national politics and public policy and housing, racism, and discrimination, and just kind of speak a little bit more on what I know and I'm comfortable with. And then if the conversation wants to get a little bit more expansive during a Q&A, that would be entirely fine with me as well. But I think I wanted to just kind of emphasize some of the systems of racism and discrimination that have kind of, on the one hand, been constructed nationwide, but then how those have kind of filtered into our community. And I think maybe give us some tools to maybe understand what people of color are facing in our community here and have faced historically, and of course, continuing going forward. And so, usually when I begin a discussion of housing, And I'll try to keep this pretty brief here, because I think the Q&A and the discussion will be far more interesting than any remarks that I'll deliver here. But I'll just single out a couple of really important moments kind of in the history of federal housing policy and wealth creation, and you know, how that might kind of then loop around to our issues that we're dealing with here, up to and including, you know, inequities, homelessness, all kinds of the front burner issues that we face as a community. So we think of the FHA loans and sort of the 30-year mortgage, right? Like coming out of the New Deal, the FHA is created in 1934. You get the Veterans Administration 45. You get the Federal National Mortgage Association 1938. And then, of course, kind of these incentives through the tax code, such as the mortgage interest deduction, things like that, to really incentivize home ownership. This is part of expanding the post-war middle class, and this was something that had an incredible success. I mean, for the better part of a generation, the United States could quite legitimately make the case that this was a middle-class nation. Now, as we know, there were huge gaps in that, and that middle-class expansion was, of course, very much so at a cost, and it was exclusive of African Americans, indigenous people, in many cases, depending on the community, people of the Jewish faith, let's say, in some areas, people of other faiths and other communities. And so time and time again, you see kind of wealth accrue, particularly kind of from that middle class strata of society through homeownership. And that is true in Alaska, it's true outside of Alaska. But I'll read to you just kind of briefly from the real estate industry's guidebook, and this is from the 1940s into the 50s, where they're calling explicitly that the realtor should, quote, never be instrumental in introducing to a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence will be clearly detrimental to the property values of the neighborhood. And this is what we come to know as a restrictive covenant, right? Which is one of the two primary ways in which housing tends to be segregated in the post-war years. You also get redlining. Redlining was the process by which the mortgage industry, particularly federally backed mortgage industry through FHA loans, would have been limited to who would have been known as kind of safe buyers, who would have maintained property values and who would have been able to have access to these 30-year mortgages, low interest, and then obviously they would have paid down their home. They would have gained the appreciation in the form of home equity. And quite simply put, the mortgage backers would not approve anybody to move into these communities unless they were of the, quote, Caucasian race. That was actually the language that you would see time and time again. And so that's the kind of national story. And, you know, again, we could talk much more about this. I'm condensing into just a couple minutes, the better part of 60 years of housing policy. But this is legal right through the 1960s. Eventually in 1968, you get the Fair Housing Act passed by Lyndon Johnson in Congress, which is, you know, kind of one of the crowning achievements of the Great Society. And out of that, you kind of have the housing market open up at least a little bit. But by that point in time, now remember, we're only kind of a generation, 2 generations outside of that moment. You have these huge inequities that have now developed between who can access homes in suburban areas in which the appreciation of those homes has continued to pace for the better part of now 30, 40, 50 plus years, and those who have been sort of trapped in these urban environments, who have been unable to get out, who oftentimes now are seeing police departments become increasingly kind of antagonistic in these spaces. And of course, that ties into what we're seeing play out today. And so as it relates to Alaska, I think it's important that we understand that these big national trends, of course, played out here. And I'll just kind of highlight a couple of points. 1950, Rogers Park, one of the quaint neighborhoods right here in town, just north of the university where I work. The first African-American home buyers, Alvin and Mary Campbell, were able to kind of circumvent the process and actually get somebody, a white person, to sign off on their loans because they knew that they probably wouldn't have been cleared for it otherwise. And as their house is being constructed, it is burnt down. and it is made clear to them that because of their race, they will not be permitted to settle in this area. This is the genesis of the formation of the Anchorage NAACP branch, which is something a lot of people don't know, but the creation of the NAACP branch here in Anchorage emerges straight out of the case of Alvin and Mary Campbell and the discrimination in the housing market. A couple of other kind of interesting facts that people may or may not know, if we're talking about kind of notable Alaskans who have kind of benefited from this system. And, you know, I think this is something that people should be aware of. Wally Hickel, right, is this kind of legendary figure in Alaska history for reasons that I think are entirely appropriate. Nonetheless, got his start as a developer, and his early developments were racially exclusionary. This is part of our community history. It's part of our state's history. I could kind of go through and list other names as well of people who have kind of developed right here in town in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, less so in the 1970s. But it really is that legacy of inequity in the housing market that we can see. And it has continued to have an impact again on wealth creation, on access and mobility, on the types of schools. I mean, you could really imagine the central place in American history that the single family home has played, and how that single family home kind of reflects the precise inequities that we've been talking about here, but also again in this nationwide discussion. Now, for my last couple minutes before I yield my time, because again, there's all kinds of other things I want to talk about. I want to highlight three people who I think are particularly notable and maybe give us some hope and inspiration. And some of you may even know these names or even recall their influence. The first one is Mahala Ashley Dickerson, M. Ashley Dickerson, the great attorney in Alaska. African-American woman from the South, close friends with Rosa Parks, makes her way to Alaska, and of all things is I believe, and somebody can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first female homesteader in the Valley, and certainly the first African-American homesteader in the Valley. She had made a career fighting these types of inequities, whether it was at the University of Alaska that had a very demonstrable record of pay inequity, had taken on the Anchorage Police Department in a really fascinating case that had to do with police violence and an incident of a fellow who was not more than, I think, 5'5", was alleged to have taken down 5 or 6 officers who were, and each one was over 6 feet tall. And it was a completely sordid tale, to be honest, but M. Ashley Dickerson defended this gentleman in court, and I think that there's a really strong case to be made that M. Ashley Dickerson should be a household name in Alaska for some of the legal battles and some of the and her contributions. I'd also point out certainly a figure that everybody knows, Elizabeth Peratrovich, and her work on behalf of anti-discrimination and her oration before the territorial legislature to then kind of launch the Anti-Discrimination Act, an Alaska Native woman in Southeast. The addendum to that a lot of people may not know is that law was actually very weakly worded, and it allowed businesses and home developers and others to kind of wiggle out of it in all kinds of ways. That's some loopholes you could drive trucks through, so to speak. And it took Beatrice Coleman, a woman in Fairbanks, an African-American woman who kind of worked with territorial legislators in the 1950s to then close some of the loopholes of the original law that was passed a few years earlier. And so I think my point here is that you see this kind of tremendous level of institutional and systemic racism that we all have to be aware of and we have to confront and we have to talk openly about. But I think we also have to understand the flip side of this is that there is this history in this state of just these, tremendous women who have kind of taken on these powers against just incredible odds, and in fact they've won. And I think there's a real inspirational story in kind of taking stock of our own history and some of our own figures here in Alaska. And so I think I'll end with that, and then we can pick up later on in a discussion. But thanks, Kim, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hartman. And we definitely, for those of you who have questions, you are welcome to put those in the chat bar now. But, Dr. Hartman, you're the author of Black History in the Last Frontier. I just ordered my copies because I'm going to be giving some of those away as Christmas gifts. So thank you. But yeah, within that book, and I'm interested to hear about some of your research because, you tell the story of some pretty awesome and unsung people. And so, the point of part 3 of this conversation is to talk about race on a national landscape. And we're hoping to tie it into what's happening locally, right where we live, because that's important. But, I grew up here in Alaska, and I learned about so few of these people, and I wish I had. So just tell me a little bit about the research process for writing that incredible book.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it goes to show, that this history is it's been amazing to me to learn how it once unknown this history is, but then also how known this history is. It just depends on who you ask, right? And some of these folks in this community, I have to say I've worked closely with Cal Williams, and who's knows this history incredibly deeply. Eleanor Andrews knows this history incredibly deeply, who's instrumental in kind of helping me out and pointing me to sources. Ed Wesley wrote the foreword to this book, who has a really interesting story of how he came to Alaska. And so I think for me, the research has really been just, it's been a lot of listening, right? And I think that's kind of a lesson that I've learned. I went into this as kind of an academically trained historian who thought that the answers would be in an archive somewhere in a dusty pile of books in the library or something like that. And actually the answers to the questions that I had are right here in the community, and the people who live these experiences and have these stories to tell and these truths to share. And so I have to say that to the extent that people don't know this story, I think it's unfortunate, and it shows, I think, that we have failed in our schools and in the university, in the history department where I teach, right? We have not done a good enough job telling the stories that are very, very available for us to know if we just kind of pay attention and ask the right people.
Definitely. And we've got Lorene Williamson, who's coming up a little later on in the call, and she's going to speak further to that education piece, because that's something that is on the minds of a lot of us in this country, knowing that Black history is American history.
That's right.
And realizing what we learned and what we did not learn. And actually, I'm going to move along to our next guest, who represents an organization that you brought up, the NAACP, the Anchorage branch. But, before I do that, you said something in an interview, Dr. Hartman, that I think is really poignant for today, as we are seeing demonstrations in the streets, and we are just seeing an outpour of grief and frustration in the wake of this Breonna Taylor verdict. So you mentioned that race is a topic that tends to surface over and over again, whether it divides or unifies a nation. So I just wanted to ask you, in your opinion, how do you think that issues around race become so divisive? And, as a nation, how do we ever move closer to that point to where that doesn't happen, or even closer to the point to where our differences are celebrated? How do we go about doing that work?
Gosh, I very truly wish I knew. I don't think it's a stretch to say this is a tough time. It very truly is. I think we have to remain hopeful, as Karina so eloquently put it, right? And I think there's a lot of reason to believe that. But I think starting at the national stage on down, I think we have right now just divisions that are quite wide. And I think the easy comparison to make is the 1960s. And we think about the civil rights movement, we think about kind of the backlash to that. But I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I think that actually the better comparison is the 1860s and 70s, 100 years earlier than that. And what you had then was this era of Reconstruction, and African American people really, I mean, participating in what truly was a multiracial democracy in the era after the Civil War. And there was an enormous pushback to that obviously manifested itself in Jim Crow and in racial terror and other ways as well. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, we're kind of at those lows yet, but I think that what we have just seen over the last several years is a flourishing in some ways of a multiracial democracy. I mean, the point came up about millennials. It's not a secret that millennials are the most diverse generation, and they'll soon be forwarded by the next generation beyond them. But I think that presents a real threat to a lot of people in this country. And I think the good news is that demographics are going to be on our side, and that sooner or later, a lot of this kind of hatred and bigotry, I think a lot of these folks are going to age out, but unfortunately, a lot of them are not. So I don't have an easy answer. I just, you know, the hopefulness I see is in a younger generation of people who are coming up, as again, we've discussed so far. But it's going to require a lot of work. And Kim, what you're doing here and hosting these forums are incredibly valuable. I think this is actually a huge part of the solution. But of course, we go forward, right?
Yeah. What else can we do? You know, and thank you for all of the work that you have done in this area. I've learned so much about you and listened to your interviews on Alaska Public Media, and you know, just keep it up. And as I said, when I connected with you online, you know, you jumped at the opportunity to do this, and we are so grateful, and I can't wait to take you out for a cup of coffee, and your books are going to come in the mail, and I'm so excited. By the way, your book was free. So
yeah, I'll put in the chat who to contact at the National Park Service, and I see a couple of other comments, including the one about raising the Jolly Roger, which is a reference to my beloved Pittsburgh Pirates, who are not all that good, but hey, that's okay. So yeah, I'll follow along in the chat, and if there's anything I can follow up on, I'll do so. But thanks again, I appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Hartman. And so, you know, with that, we, Dr. Hartman brought up the NAACP, and we learned about their origins here in Alaska, which I did not know of their origins here in this state. So again, you know, I had been in this space of learning not only about, you know, my own communities, but about the Alaska Native communities here in this state and elsewhere, about, oh my gosh, so many different people and races and nationalities. And I think, if anything, that is the benefit of this time. We're learning about ourselves, and we're learning about each other. And as we prepare for local and national elections, which are coming up soon, and I have to remind everyone, we're in a nonpartisan space, okay? So I know a lot of this can get politicized pretty quickly. But, you know, many of us are feeling a touch of anxiety, because we know that the Postal Service has been defunded, and we know that because of a pandemic, it's going to be increasingly tough for people in already disenfranchised communities, and people who aren't even in disenfranchised communities, to make their voice heard at the ballot box. So absentee ballots are a great option for right now, but for people of color, this battle at the ballot box is not new. Yes, we know we need to increase our numbers at the ballot box. And when I say that in the Black community, that's what I'm trying to say to impart to anyone on this call. We know as a Black community that we need to increase our participation at the ballot box. We know that's an ongoing conversation, but we also know that Black and Brown people have historically had challenges in making their voices heard. So with that, I would like to welcome Taria Ware with the NAACP Anchorage branch. Taria, if you want to unmute yourself, and welcome to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you for the invite, Ms. Kimberly. I am so happy to be here with all of you guys today. You know, we are at the NAACP gearing up for what we are saying is the fight for our lives. And as people of color, this truly is the time where every person, regardless of your color, needs to vote, regardless of your party. Have your voice matter. And so we're trying to join this into young people, old people, people who may have voted once, people who really believe that their voice doesn't matter. It's been a great time to see this movement flourish. We have seen rappers rap about, you know, voting and giving education. I actually learned something from a rap song, and I was surprised. I was like, what? I can't believe I learned that. And so just being able to, you know, reach younger people. So when they're 18, they're invigorated to vote and to get out there and be a part of this process. I think somewhere, and we've had so many conversations in so many different rooms about where did we lose that? Where did we lose that fight that our ancestors had in the 60s, that our grandparents had, or my grandparents had in the 60s and 50s? They wanted to vote. They fought for voting. They died for voting. They were marching for voting. They were boycotting for all kinds of things. When did we stop as people of color thinking that that is important? And so our mission with the NAACP is really to talk to young people, to encourage them. We have a wonderful AXO team, and if you don't know much about the NAACP, we have a great convention happening now. We've been going on it's a virtual convention, so you can pop in and see things. Their website, their national website, is a wealth of information about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and just how you can take action as a normal person. Maybe you're not an NAACP member, but you go on the website and you find something that is interesting and you're like, hey, I want to sign on that. They have made some sample letters, all kind of forms for you to just sign on to the cause. So a lot of people don't know a lot about voter suppression. There's a little bit here or there. Folks want to talk about how they used to count, how many pieces of bubble gum were in the jar, or they did a poll tax, or they talked about literacy tests. And it's like, well, why aren't literacy tests okay? Well, back then, their questions weren't questions that everyone would know. It was questions that only white people would know. And so they weren't able to pass the test, but they would stand there and they would try over and over. But voter suppression is still happening now, and it looks so different. And I think what bothers a lot of us the most is that people are actually making excuses for voter suppression. They're saying, oh, well, the polling lines are longer. They should have gotten there earlier. They should have they should have done an absentee ballot. They should have done early voting. Well, what happens when in your state they change the polling place the day before or the week before but didn't let anybody know, or they actually closed the doors early so you couldn't get in to vote, or they didn't have absentee voting available, or they decided, and especially in Alaska, we have looked at this recently, that you need a witness for your ballot if you're going to mail it in. And during a pandemic, some of our elderly and just regular people do not have anyone to witness their ballot box. And so how does their vote not count because they could not find a witness? We're seeing this not just for people of color, but definitely in communities of color far more, where this is happening all the time. And so we wanted to shine a light on it. Social media has been very helpful with telling people, hey, look at these long lines. These are not our imagination. These are people standing out in 100-degree temperatures, just to get their vote in, and then to be denied because the polling place is closed, because there's not enough workers, or because they closed down several polling places. The other thing that the NAACP is looking at is getting felons the right to vote again. It's almost like, and I'll put it in layman's term, that they're being punished a second time. So they've served their time, they're released, they've done what they needed to do for society, they've paid their debt, and now they cannot vote. And they cannot vote against a system that they have encountered intimately. Why is that? Why is it they can't vote? So if we look at history and we go back and we're talking about, okay, back in, I believe it was the 40s, I believe, when you look at the 13th Amendment, they talked about how that was started because they wanted to ensure that Black people couldn't vote. And so it says in the 13th Amendment that if you have a felony charge, you can't vote. So then it started to spike as far as the charges for African Americans. All of a sudden, people who weren't being charged with things were now being charged with felonies for the littlest things, and they were being carried out. And then all of a sudden, they couldn't vote anymore. Their voice no longer mattered. And we're still doing this. And states can, reverse that. And I know Florida is looking into it. I know a couple of places at the NAACP is really like, hey, we really need to overturn this. This is something they would like Congress to do. Excuse me, sorry for all the extra background. There will be ringing, there will be kid noises, there will be everything. So I will apologize right now for that. So we're looking at trying to get felons the right to vote again. And then we also recognize that some of the things that felons were charged with were not correct. They should not have been charged with that. They were erroneous charges. And so getting them the right to vote, even after their charges are dismissed or they're found, not guilty, there's still another hurdle for them to go through in order to get their voting rights back. And we feel like this should be a simple process. You shouldn't need a lawyer. You shouldn't need tons of money in order for your voice to be heard, which is our American right. So why people ask the NAACP, why are we supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020? And I will be honest that I didn't understand this myself. I'm like, well, we already approved the Voting Rights Act. Why are we doing one in 2020? So I started to delve deeper, and I encourage you guys to do the same. And I'll read directly from the NAACP website, but apparently in 2013, the Supreme Court made a decision in Shelby County versus Holder. And it basically said that the states had no jurisdictions which were required to comply with pre-clearance directives in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so the problem is that the U.S. Supreme Court has made it clear because of that Congress can fix it and place a law to replace that criteria, which makes it to where states would not be allowed to make changes to their election laws or policies without proving in advance that the proposed changes will not disenfranchise any voters. Currently, right now, no state has to do that. That is a problem. And we are seeing this happen in several other states where polling places are closing with no notices, where people are not being given access to early voting or absentee ballots. And, Alaska is, I would say, in my opinion, better at it. But we, like I said, are looking at, even with the witness signature, something I did not even think would be true. The ACLU has brought to the NAACP's attention that they have thrown away ballots. And I'm like, well, how did you do that without even having the conversation? I don't even remember that being a thing. So another thing that we're looking at is how are you communicating to the community, to the people, what it is they are supposed to do? And I don't believe that our government is doing a great job of communicating that, especially to people of color who may or may not have TVs, who may or may not have access to the newspaper or internet. And so how are we letting everyone know, hey, this is what we do now to get your voice heard. This is where you go to make sure you can cast your ballot. This is what you need to cast your ballot. How do we do that?
Right.
So the NAACP has a great thing coming up with Oprah. I like Oprah, so I was excited, and I'm looking for it now. So she's actually hosting tomorrow on 8 p.m. Eastern. So that's going to be 4 p.m. our time. It's Own Your Vote. Our vote depends on it. And it's a virtual voters conversation. If any of you are interested, she is actually partnering with the NAACP on that. We are excited for it. The other thing I would encourage everyone to look at is a congressional postcard. So the NAACP on our national website has a congressional postcard. And what it is you go on there for every state, and it will tell you how each congressman or U.S. senator has voted compared to what the NAACP has advised, or has advised, I guess you can say that. And so our congressman, Mr. Don Young, has an F for civil rights votes, or voting towards civil rights actions. And so do our U.S. Senators, Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan. They both have F scores. I would encourage you to look at why they have an F. They actually have it really nicely outlined, what questions they were, like, did you vote in William Barr for Attorney General? Yes, no. And then it tells you how they are in line and how they're not. And so I encourage everyone to do so and look at that moving forward. I know that the Alaska Black Caucus and the NAACP is going to be hosting a Zoom candidate forum this Saturday at 11 a.m. with candidates Elise Gavin, candidate Dr. Al Gross, U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan has been invited, and so has U.S. Congressman Don Young been invited also. And so we're hoping to have a great conversation and make sure that everyone is informed on how they have voted in the past, how they wish to vote in the future, or how they plan to vote, because these things are still occurring, and we want to figure out a plan to where all Americans can be on the same playing field, especially when it comes to voting.
Thank you so much, Taria. If anyone has any questions, you can post those now in our chat function. But I think that, you know, I applaud you for working on the fair and balanced piece of, you know, talking to our candidates. I know that they are so hard to wrangle. I know that personally. We've been working behind the scenes with a couple of organizations to, you know, have a fair and balanced forum amongst the candidates, and it is very one-sided and has been very one-sided, even with an enormous amount of backing. And we had to call that off. That was something that we did not go forward with, because it is important now more than ever. You know, we talk about a lot of the policies that exist and, you know, may harm people in disenfranchised communities, and, you know, keep a lot of those structures that we've been talking about in place. And so now more than ever, it is so important that, you know, we hear from our elected leaders, and you know, from those who would have the honor of leading. And I wonder why more people don't know that the Civil Rights Act was gutted. I wonder how that happens. I don't know, Taria, can you speak to that at all?
So there have been several theories, but truly it was because we were not told. We were not told. It was not put out there. There was not any kind of press about it. It was done so quietly. It was almost like a secret vote where they voted on this large packet, as they continuously do. They have these mountains of paperwork for one act. And inside it, where you thought all the things that were there from 1965 were there, when the state started going through, it's like, oh, well, that's missing. Oh, so we can do this now. And when it was challenged in the Supreme Court, it was like, oh, you can do this now. And so now we need Congress to act, to go ahead and put those teeth back into the Voting Rights Act. Do I think it's going to happen right now? We are hoping after November 3rd, when things settle down, that they will want to do the work that is necessary. Because again, this doesn't just affect people of color, this affects all people. Because when you shut down a polling place, you're not just shutting it down for one demographic, you're shutting it down for everyone in that area. And so there are Caucasians, Hispanics, monks, there are all kinds of people. Unfortunately, it seems to happen more often in communities of color. And so that is why the NAACP is trying to step in. And there's nothing they can seem to have done so far to stop it from happening ahead of time. So they're saying, if there's a law, then there should be a way to where before we vote, we won't have these issues. People won't be standing outside in long lines for 3 and 4 hours.
Thank you so much, Taria. It's important to know, you know, how these things are kept in place and how they exist. So thank you for giving us some insight there. I see a couple of thank yous in the chat bar. Thank you for making the time. I know you are a busy mom, so if you want to hang out with the rest of the conversation, you are welcome to. But I just wanted to, again, thank you for your participation as we move to our next guest for the evening.
You.
And yeah, my pleasure. Our next guest is Lorene Williamson, and she is zooming in from New Jersey. She is the co-founder and co-curator of the Museum of Uncut Funk. And so what we're gonna kind of do is to pivot here, since this is indeed a conversation about race on a national landscape. We are going to talk about some imagery that has existed over time via mass media. We have talked a lot on these conversations and in individual conversations about the existence of unconscious bias and how that happens and how images make meaning. And so Lorene is doing some pretty incredible work in, you know, kind of sharing how mass media can be a tool for that. And we are going to talk a little bit about the blaxploitation-era, Lorene, which is your specialty. But first, I just wanted you to introduce yourself and share with us more about your work and your vision with the Museum of Uncut Funk. Welcome.
Hi, Alaska. My name is Lorene, and I am the co-founder and co-curator of the Museum of Uncut Funk. We're a virtual museum that celebrates 1970s Black culture and all of the amazing Black icons that made the decade so funky. It's our favorite decade because we're babies from the 70s. Our museum features our very unique collection that includes movie posters from over 200 Black films that were made during that decade. I don't know if many people know that that many films were made. A lot of people do associate Black films from that decade with blaxploitation, which tends to describe more of the crime types of films that were made then, but there were films made in every genre. There were comedies and Westerns and horror films and you know, family films, and it was a very prolific era in terms of Black film that was created. The first time that you really saw Black people being portrayed heroically in a lot of instances. So we can kind of debate, you know, whether the imagery was racist or not. There were a lot of positives that came out of the films. I mean, we collect the posters because the imagery is beautiful, but because you see a lot of powerful people. You know, you see Pam Grier and, you know, people like Tamara Dobson. You know, for the first time, Black women were featured prominently in films. They led films. They were featured prominently on the promotional materials that used to promote those films. So we collect that in our collection. One of the interesting things also about those posters is that those films aired all over the world. We've got posters from every country from the 1970s. And a lot of times you don't think that Black films, you know, that our film a culture is imported all over the world, but back in the 70s, it certainly was. And it just, you know, kind of speaks to, you know, how Black culture was consumed, you know, globally, you know, 50 years ago, as much as it is today. So we have those in our collection. We also have animation artwork that was used under the camera to produce Saturday morning cartoons, which is really significant because it's the first time in animation history that you saw positive depictions of Black people in animation. For the 60 years prior to that, we were depicted as mammies and coons and cannibals and animals and all kinds of really stereotypic, you know, horrifying images, you know, people with bulging eyes and big lips, and, you know, everything less than human. There was no humanity in how we were depicted. There were, you know, we'll talk about some of the images that I'll share with you, but you know, in the first time in the late 60s, early 70s, you start to see positive depictions. And that was significant because everybody back then, I don't know how many of you are in my age group, but there was no cable. So we all watched the same television. All the kids saw the same cartoons. So it was, you know, really powerful to have everybody watch, you know, Black kids and white kids and Hispanic kids and all kinds of kids play together in these cartoons, solve mysteries together, save the world together. It was really kind of, you know, I think in animated form, you know, kind of the what Dr. King really talked about, you know, everybody being equal, everybody getting along, everybody working. It worked at least on TV on Saturday mornings back in the 70s. We also have coins and stamps in our collection that feature all of our Black history heroes. And with those two collections alone, we span from 1619 through to present day. So we cover the entire timeline of Black people and Black history in the United States. And it's important because, you know, the way that history is being taught these days, you know, you have a little bit of coverage on slavery, then it kind of jumps to the civil rights movement, and we cover Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and everything prior to 1619 never gets talked about. So we, you know, enter, you know, kind of history conversations as enslaved people. And then, you know, we go right to the 60s where we're protesting and nothing happens in between and nothing happens after. So those artifacts are critically important because, you know, one of the things, and you know, we'll talk about that, you know, a little later on when we have a little back and forth, is that a lot of folks don't believe that Black people have made contribution to this country, significant contribution, that we have been here the entire time. Our history is truly American history. It's interwoven with every period of history, every aspect of history. And we have been there in every war. We've been fighting, always continually to try to bring America closer to its promise of being a more perfect union. We've been right there. So those artifacts really do demonstrate that.
Right.
A little about the,
I wanted to quickly interject and ask if
Sure.
now is a good time if I can share some of these images. You are getting a couple of comments there. One from our friend Judith Crotty saying that you have a fascinating museum, and I understand that that now lives in an online space because you've taken
Yes, it
your
does.
exhibitions all around the nation and the globe.
Yes, we have.
If you could post the link to
Sure.
the Museum of Uncut Funk for those who would like to explore. I'm going to share my screen
Sure.
and kind of share a little bit, you know, if I could ask you to expand on these images that you have sent along. And I am going to, all right, so let's start here. Go ahead, Lorraine.
Well, this is a title card from an animated short called Clean Pastures. And just to give you a little background, prior to the 1970s, animation was shown as film shorts. They were actually produced to show in between films in theaters. And then probably like the 1950s, as you know, everybody kind of went to television, they were, you know, adapted for TV and ran pretty much up until the 1960s, until, you know, we got into civil rights and people really pushed back on how racist these cartoons were. So, you know, what happened was they were essentially banned, you know, and are not shown these days, but they were shown pretty consistently for the first 60 years. So, you know, one of the things that animators did in the, you know, 20s and 30s, because a lot of them were big jazz enthusiasts, is they, you know, they thought they were paying homage to, you know, our big jazz, you know, heroes like Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington and all of those great musicians from that time. But the way they were depicted in the cartoons was very, you know, demeaning. And you can see a depiction here of Cab Calloway. You know, everybody kind of looked like Step and Fetch It characters, you know, really portrayed as being, you know, unintelligent, and just, again, kind of lacking humanity. So this, again, was something that every kid saw, because every kid went to the theaters, whether it was a, you know, a segregated theater, you know, white children saw it sitting downstairs, black children saw it sitting upstairs. And these are the types of images that people have consumed for a long time about Black people, that, you know, that we are, you know, unintelligent, lazy people, as opposed to, you know, the real people that we are. This is an animated cell that's actually a limited edition recreation of another cartoon. And these were Looney Tunes cartoons called Inky, the Little Lion Hunter. And this is an little African boy with a spear that was, you know, again, shown with big red lips and very stereotypical depictions of people from Africa in this cartoon. And a lot of the cartoons were like this. Like, so there were over 600 of these cartoon film shorts made from you know, 1900 into the 1960s. So what happens is we go through civil rights. You have a lot of pushback from the NAACP and other organizations to get the studios to take, you know, to stop producing this very racist material. And you start to see studios start to bring in Black talent behind the camera, start to utilize more Black talent, you know, in front of the camera in terms of voice actors and things like that. And you start to see significant change in terms of how Black people were depicted. So you see the first time that you have positive Black characters on television for kids to watch. This is Peter Jones. He was the Black drummer from the Hardy Boys cartoon. And he's the first positive Black male animated character to ever appear on television. This is the first Black superhero to appear in a cartoon, Verb from the Schoolhouse Rock series. And it had a very funky soundtrack, you know, very blaxploitation-esque. But, you know, we had never seen superheroes, you know, depicted as Black people prior to the 1970s. The next one is Estrella. She was part of the Space Sentinels, and she was the first positive Black female superheroine to ever appear in Saturday morning cartoons. So there's a huge revolution in the 70s of just, you know, this explosion of Blackness in animated form, you know, from the Fat Albert to the Harlem Globetrotters to the Jackson 5 to Josie and the Pussycats with the first Black positive female animation character. And again, something that all children consumed because we all watched the same cartoons, and then we would go to school with our Fat Albert lunchbox and talk about how great the cartoons were over the weekend. but a significant change in how Hollywood depicted Black people in animated form.
I love Schoolhouse Rock. Thank you for,
Yes.
for sharing those with us. And, you know, I kind of wanted to bring it into present day, right? Because,
Sure.
you know, in recent months, we've had the conversation. So we're seeing how they're reducing production of Gone with the Wind, or making that large land available. We've seen that they're taking the Aunt Jemima off the pancake box, or the Miss
Right.
Butterworth, and, you know, all of these things with that having to do with racist imagery. There's still a very, you know, heated ongoing debate over blackface. Can you just speak to how those images make meaning, and how they just, you know, have either progressed or regressed over time? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I think the imagery has gotten progressively better over time. Again, you know, you go all the way back to, you know, slave ads, and how we were depicted in some of the first printed depictions of Black people, and how we were described. And then you go through, you know, the whole blackface era and the minstrel shows. And, you know, back in the day, Black people were used to advertise everything, but the depictions were just incredibly racist. I mean, they had products that were called niggerhead products. I mean, it was just a very consistent depiction of Black people as, again, less than human, you know, ignorant, slow, lazy. So, you know, this decades of the way that we were shown. And not only in the United States, but all over the world. You know, you find Darky toothpaste still, and things like that. And Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben were a part of that era, you know, where we were, you know, again, depicted as maids and slaves and things like that. So, you know, I think the imagery has gotten progressively better, but it's really difficult to undo centuries of that type of portrayal. And I think that that's what we're dealing with now. There are, you know, fixed perceptions of who we are, not created by us. You know, certainly I don't think validated by us, but they are there. And it's very difficult, you know, to kind of fight against that, you know, kind of learned memory of things that people have seen, you know, for a long time, which is why, you know, Black history education is so important. We've got to change that. And we got to start with kids. You know, we've got to educate folks on the just systemic racism that has been in this country, and the real, you know, just ongoing campaign to depict us as less than human beings. And, you know, I think that's why, you know, some of the images from the 70s are so important, because it's really the first time that you start to see from a pop culture perspective, from a mass culture perspective, changes in the way we were depicted, not only in animation, but in film and television and comic books. Now, was it all perfect? No. Was it significantly better? Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, I had another question for you around education. And if anyone has any questions for Laureen, feel free to put those in the chat bar. But, you know, kind of in the way that you're talking about imagery. So, you know, my studies have largely to do with mass media and journalism. And I'll tell you what kind of frightens me, you know, seeing in the discourse right now, what concerns me. I'm seeing the narrative of race war right after the election. It's almost like, you know, we're seeing some, and I won't say whether they're conservative or non-conservative, but we are seeing bloggers kind of speak up this, you know, pitting peoples against each other. You know, even conversations about, I've seen recent narratives, Black Lives Matter rally versus Blue Lives Matter. And you see that largely in communities, and it goes out to communities and kind of, you know, helps to gen up a lot of this unrest that we're feeling. And, you know, I don't know how we tackle that. And I guess probably my point for even bringing it up is to make people aware that it happens, and to be on guard when they see it. Because let me tell you, it is perfectly acceptable to support the movement that is Black Lives Matter, but to also value your police, right? And to know how important and how loved the police are in our communities and how they are needed, right? And, you know, we have many of our own who are police officers and who are out there, it's not the, it's that it kind of creates that infighting that I just see is so dangerous. I was looking at an article yesterday and they're saying that, if this president is not reelected, that people are going to take to the streets and it's going to be another civil war. And that really concerns me, because I know, again, in the same way that images make meaning, words make meaning. And you really can speak anger and hatred and violence into the discourse, the same way that it happens with images. Did you want to speak any further to that?
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say, there have been cycles of history. Like this is not something that's new, right? We have been through this before, and that's why it's important for people to understand this. I mean, we have moments of progress, and then we have moments of pushback, and that was talked about earlier. And we are in one of those moments of pushback. I mean, we had 8 years of a Black president. We had 8 years of a coalition coming together that celebrated diversity, and put, gay issues in the forefront and put women's issues in the forefront. And there are people in this country that don't like that. So we are now, and I think a lot of ignorance in terms of how important it is to be civically responsible and to vote. I think a lot of people have taken that for granted, and didn't do what they were supposed to do. And now we find ourselves in this situation. But I think it's important to understand that, the reason why we're having so much, turmoil is because we're not, having the same conversation, right? Black people are having a conversation based on 400 years of, going from being enslaved to having a little bit of a taste of freedom, to having all those freedoms taken away, to continually having to fight, to again, get the rights that everybody else has and to be treated equally with everybody else. And we have a history of that to back it up. That's the conversation that we're having. Other folks are having a totally different conversation. They're fighting civil wars that they lost, and they're protecting monuments of slave owners and things like. We're not having that conversation, right? Having the conversation about how do we continue to move the country forward, and how do we, find a way to live together, in peace and equality. And the only way we can all have that conversation is for us all to understand the history of this country, to understand how we got to where we are. And that's the problem. You look at, I know this is not supposed to be a political forum, but, we've got a president of the United States that is literally saying, we are not going to teach real history. We're going to teach this version of history that, tells certain people what they want to hear. How are we supposed to come together if we can't have the same conversation?
Right. I just wanted to, I want to hear what you're doing in the way of education, but I want to address a couple questions that are happening right now in the chat room. And this is a great time for discussion. Again, if anyone on the call has some insight, I left a little bit of time on the tail end of our conversation in the name of it being our final conversation. We're always crunched for that dialogue that we want to have that is so important. This is a safe space to do that. And we've really enjoyed holding space for that. So, in the term of, and Tammy, if you are willing to unmute your microphone, you have put into the chat box, what rights are being taken away? What is the difference between your version of history and Trump's? So, again, we give everyone the freedom of expression in this state, but Tammy, I didn't know if you wanted to unmute yourself and speak further to your question there, or specifically who you're addressing your question to.
Hi, I'm a trans woman who lives in the Valley, and I don't usually speak out in things like this, but I don't feel the amount of hatred that people are telling me that I should feel from the community. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear people say things like, our rights are being taken away, I think that's a general statement, and I don't know which rights you're talking about. And so my questions are genuine.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about this topic, and so I would like to know some of these details. Like, I know that spent some time talking about the felons voting, but in 48 states, felons can get the right to vote again once they complete their sentence, including in Alaska. So I don't understand how that's a big problem right now either. But yeah, I guess those are my two questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking this opportunity to speak out. I applaud you. And just to get some more context behind your question, when you say our rights are being taken away, are you talking specifically about trans women?
I'm talking about any group that feels that their rights are being taken away. Black people, Black
marginalized.
people, or Jewish, or whichever group. I just kept hearing the last speaker say that their rights are being taken away, and we need to fight at the ballot box to stop our rights from being taken away. And I was wondering what rights those are.
Okay, well, just with the understanding that I think that is a broad question, because we all are coming from different perspectives on that. We are all of different races and backgrounds and genders. So I just want to acknowledge that one person is probably not going to be able to answer your question. But in regards to the prior speaker, I think that you are referencing Taria. Taria, I don't know if you are still on the call. If you wanted to chime in and answer that question, Dr. Hartman, certainly, Lorene, you are welcome to answer that question, but I am, encouraging the dialogue, and you certainly have the space to do so if anyone wants to chime
in. If I could I'll say something about Florida. I don't need to, I think, explain this to a lot of people here. I mean, Florida, when you say it's 48 out of the 50 states, I'm not sure if that's quite correct. I think there are a few other states that might be included in that category. Florida obviously is the most important one, but as it turns out, Florida has about 30 million people. Florida has the highest rates of incarceration in the United States, maybe outside of Alabama or Mississippi or some other states in the deep South that have had, for historic reasons, really kind of troubling rates of incarceration that map onto lines of race and ethnicity. So I think that's a particularly good example, actually, to talk about how the criminal justice system is, well, I guess the relationship between being inequities in the criminal justice system and voting rights. I think it's a really illustrative case study, and I don't think that it's at all necessarily an aberration. In fact, I think it's right at the center of the debate. And I mean, you talk about you talk about elections that are decided on a knife's edge, where we may only be talking about a couple hundred votes, and as evidence of that, look at the year 2000. I mean, it's very likely that this level of voter disenfranchisement could, in fact, have a serious impact on the election, one way or the other. So that's the only point that I would make.
Thank you, Dr. Hartman. Does anyone else? I see Taria, and then I'm going to take Amanda. Actually, well, wait, I'm going to take Amanda because we haven't heard from Amanda, and then I'm going to come back to Taria. So Amanda, feel free to chime in.
I just sort of wanted to share something that Taria had shared earlier that I think is an important thing to talk about as we are in this global pandemic. Alaska currently requires people who vote absentee by mail to have their signature witnessed. And if you are isolated because you have health concerns or anything like that, and the United States Postal Service is not allowing postal clerks to act as witnesses. Like, I think that there are things that we should be concerned about, and these are opportunities for us to talk about, that it is making it more challenging for folks to vote and to have access to other things like this during these times. And so just sort of wanted to share that as another thing that I had heard Taria share with us. So thank you. Thanks for this conversation too.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Taria, did you have any additional things to add?
Yes, so I was speaking more to what Tammy was talking about. And so, Tammy, you're correct. It's Florida, it's a couple of other states that actually oppose felons from voting. But the issue that the NAACP is seeing is that even though it says that felons can vote, the question is, are they able to vote? And that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. what prevents them from voting? And what we're finding is you almost need a degree to figure out how do you get your Voting Rights Act. And when we're talking about people of color, people who come from socioeconomic backgrounds that may or may not have the resources to navigate these systems, it should not take you to get a lawyer that costs a retainer of $2,000 to get back your actual right that you have to vote in an election, not only for your municipality, but for your national elections. And so that is the issue, is that it says they can vote, but they're not given the opportunity. They're not giving an equal playing field. And so we go back to, you can even go back to what we talk about when we say systematic racism. A lot of people do not believe there is systematic racism. And we want to talk about how it looks different, and we need to acknowledge that it is different, that it is actually here, and maybe it doesn't look like what you think it looks like. It's not that I can't drink at the same water fountain as you anymore. It's that maybe I want to buy this home in this certain neighborhood, but now I can't do so because redlining still exists in certain communities. And you're seeing that in our public school system. You're seeing that when we're looking at public schools versus private schools and how the funding happens. Even with COVID, you saw articles with our own ASD talking about how much money they were going to lose because of the fact of virtual learning. And then we're seeing how people of color, their opportunities to have pod groups or low income students having access to pods or private teachers is different than usually a person that is not of color, a Caucasian person. So if I'm going back to your topic just simply about felons and their right to vote, they may have the right to vote, but that does not mean they are able to access that right. And that is what we are fighting for, is for them to have access to that and not to have to go through a whole bunch of different hoops that is not even outlined, because every state has a different process and every state has a different person or different you go to the county and the county does this, and then you go to the elections person, and maybe it's not that elections person because Anchorage is different. We're all, it's just Anchorage. It's to me, it's pretty easy to navigate here. But you go someplace like Texas, and there is a county for this city, and then there might be a county for these 3 cities here. So how does one person navigate that? That may or may not have a vehicle or have food to eat? Is that going to be their priority? So I hope that helps a little bit more. And I'm not sure how many more wonderful, courageous conversations there are, but I can probably get you some, reading material if you want to look more into that yourself, and maybe join the cause on helping felons get their rights back to vote.
Thank you, Tammy. I see you still here. Did you have any other questions? I'm hoping that helped a little bit to shine a light on the questions that you had.
Yeah, that did answer those questions. I just feel like it says that this is an open forum, but I just feel like some opinions aren't welcome. Like, I feel like when she says, and I can tell that she's being honest, but where I'm coming from is that my community was told over the last year that trans women are being killed across the country at extraordinary rates. And I believe that. Several of us believed that. And it took one of my friends actually looked at the numbers, and trans women are actually less likely to be killed compared to the national murder rate. We were lied to by the media. And I just worry that some of these talking points that it's racially motivated to restrict voting rights, or somebody doesn't have a car, or it's too difficult. Why? I grew up, I haven't seen color except for the last year when the media started shoving color down everybody's throat. I still don't care. Doesn't matter to me what color somebody is. If I'm going to interact with them, or you know what I mean, it's are they a good person or not,
Yeah.
and are they nice to me? And I think it's harmful, and I don't understand the argument that Black people aren't capable of navigating the same voting registration laws as other people. It's everybody goes by the same set of rules, and I don't understand why a certain demographic would have more trouble than another one.
Right. Well, you know, Tammy, I will say, and I wish we had more time to continue this conversation with you, but what I will say is this is a welcoming space and you are welcome here. And it has been our pleasure to give you a platform here. And I think that we have had this conversation respectfully. And, you know, what I will do before I move back to Lorene to continue talking about what her organization is doing with education, I will say, and I'm not sure what race you are, but just for me speaking as a Black woman who was born and raised in Anchorage, took off around the age of 25 and returned at the age of 42 to raise my family. I am very open in saying that we live in a loving, incredible, wonderful community. And as we, you know, address these issues around race and around equity, you know, while our state may not look like the state where my sister lives, which is Atlanta, where there are still segregated schools and all types of very hyper racial issues happening, I will say that even though it may not look to you like it looks to a Black woman like me, even though they may not look the same, and I think it's wonderful that, you know, that you said you don't see race, but these things are something that we feel is very important that we have the space to talk about, because for me as a Black woman, I have my experiences and I wake up in this skin and I know what those experiences feel like. And I just want to honor those who have come out in a peaceful space such as this one, or even those who came out to celebrate the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington down in Town Square, and were met with agitators. I think that takes a lot of courage to do that. And I just want to, you know, continue to celebrate that advocacy and give everyone the space to speak to their individual experiences, just as you have as a trans woman. My God, I have never walked in your shoes. So I honor you for coming to this space. And I hope that we did our best in answering your questions. And again, you know, if anyone has any questions or concerns, that's why the name of this is called Courageous Conversations About Race, right? We get courageous and we say what we may not feel comfortable saying in other spaces. So I thank you for joining us. And if anyone has anything, you know, that they, you know, might want to respond, if there's something you feel compelled to share, I would invite you to do that in the chat bar. And in the interest of time, we are going to move the conversation along. But yeah, thank you too, Tammy. Thank you. I see your comment. I would like to take it back to Lorene. And Lorene, if you could tell me, you know, education has kind of resurfaced, right? It's kind of popped up in all three of these conversations that I've been learning. That's a biggie. So let's take it back there and tell us a little bit about what your organization, the Museum of Uncut Funk, what you're doing in and around education on a national scope.
Well, I mean, we're clearly trying to educate people about unknown aspects of Black history through our collection and through our website and through our exhibitions. But we're also trying to do something a little bit more formal, because it is possible for people to live in this country and have completely different experiences based on where we've come from and you know, how we you know, where we live and what color we are, and you know, a whole bunch of different things. And I don't think a lot of people really do understand the Black experience in this country. It is not taught in schools. What is taught in schools is just a small portion of it. Candidly, some of the stuff in the textbooks is just lies. There are some textbooks in this country that talk about slavery as, you know, an immigration / work study type of program, and that was not the case. There are, you know, a lot of you know, schools that don't teach anything at all. It is not mandated nationally that, you know, every student in every school learns about Black history. The standards change from state to state. Again, the textbooks are different depending on what part of the country you're in. And, you know, nobody is really getting the truth about, you know, our 400 years of existence here. We're not teaching the hard history. We're not teaching about, you know, enslavement and the brutality of enslavement. We're not teaching about, you know, everybody saw Juneteenth as this brand new holiday and didn't understand what the significance of it was. Things like that that are critically important. So, you know, we've started a petition campaign. It's called, you know, America, It's Time to Tell the Truth and Teach the Truth. And what we are advocating for is national standards for Black history that are put together by Black history experts, not by the textbook companies. We are, you know, advocating that all students learn Black history starting very early on. But by 9th grade, it's too late. So that they, you know, start learning aspects of it in pre-K kindergarten. That, you know, our history starts prior to enslavement. There, you know, is a whole continent that is rich of history and our contribution before we got here that people don't know about. And, you know, it's important, again, to teach the hard topics, to teach it truthfully, so that people do understand how you can basically have two systems, how systemic racism has worked over time, how white supremacy has driven that. You know, the investment in things like showing, you know, very racist images. I mean, that is all part of portraying people in a certain way and getting people to treat people in a certain way. And that has been going on for a long time here. So, you know, what we're saying is we're never going to heal as a country unless we're having the same conversation. We're never going to heal as a country unless we have the same common understanding. And it is way past time to get that done. You know, the kids are out in the street. You know, there are Black kids and white kids and, you know, Hispanic kids, Latino kids, you know, gay, straight, whatever. They're out there fighting. So they're not having a problem interacting with each other. It's the adults and the systems that need to get it together and figure out how, you know, we can do right by, you know, the generations that are coming up, so that we don't have, you know, every 50 years, you know, we're on the verge of having a race war over things. It's got to stop. So our campaign, you can find it on our website, museumofuncutfunk.com, America, Time to Tell the Truth and Teach the Truth. It's time to have a singular conversation about Black history, which is American history, so that everybody understands it and we can, you know, get past these conversations about, you know, how we see it, how other people see it. We should all see it the same way, because the facts are there. You know, it's time to stop whitewashing what's been going on here. And that's, you know, just really kind of how we're looking at it.
Well, thank you to you, Lorene. Again, if you have any questions for Lorene, we are running a little bit early tonight, which I think is a great thing, because we all have families and lives, and many of us have done the work that you have joined us on the call since call number 1, and now we have moved all the way to call number 3. And I just wanted to say, on behalf of Women's Power League Alaska, we very much see this work as a marathon, not a sprint. We are ending this conversation and ending this series tonight. However, we hope to keep these ongoing, you know, conversations happening in spaces to where everyone feels valued, and to where we are creating safe spaces and spaces of equity. We think that is important, and we know that we've got a long way to go in this area. And also, someone else who knows that is one of our sponsors, the Alaska Humanities Forum. I have put their link there in the chat bar for everyone to see if you wanted to check this out. And what they've done is they've done something really cool. So they've launched a 2.5-month cohort in the name of these conversations. And that cohort is for people just like you and I, who are looking to do deeper work on race relations and equity in our communities. And the name of that cohort is titled Conversations Across Generations. And so, you know, the real backstory behind that is they say, well, we may talk about race across generations with our own families who often share our racial identities. Other opportunities to have deep multi-generational discussions are limited. Conversations across generations will support 3 2.5-month-long cohort journeys consisting of transformative intergenerational conversations about racial identity and experiences of racism in Alaska, guided by the question, what does racial equity demand of us all? So I wanted to offer that up to anyone who is interested in taking part. It is free from the Alaska Humanities Forum. I see someone there posting in the chat box. If you're interested in joining, please email me. So we do have someone from the Alaska Humanities Forum on this call. Before we wrap up, I would like to take the time to thank our sponsors and everyone who has supported us along these conversations, and that would definitely be the Alaska Humanities Forum, that would be YWCA Alaska, that would be the 4-Acre Group, and that would be GCI. So before we prepare to wrap up, if anyone, I wanted to open the floor if anyone has any additional questions or comments. Like I said, we tried to keep the guests limited tonight so we could have room for this talk back and to share in this space. So before we wrap up, I wanted to give you the opportunity to do that, either in the chat bar or by unmuting yourself.
Yeah, I had a question, and that was, do you work with the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State University?
I think that's for you, Lorene.
Is that for me? No, we don't work with them. We're aware of them and have had some conversations, but we don't work directly with them now.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining the call, and thank you to everyone. I'm going to release you for your evening. Thank you for our guests tonight. Thank you, Dr. Ian. Thank you, Lorene. Who else am I missing? Thank you, Taria from the NAACP. I appreciate this, and I invite everyone, look, if you like what you see here, or if you want to stay connected with Women's Power League of Alaska, you can find us on Facebook. We're on all socials, but we are definitely most active on our Facebook page, and you can also check out WPLAK.com to sign up for our mailing list, and I'm so grateful for all of you for showing up with us and jumping in and being courageous. And so with that, I'm going to sign off and wish you a good evening. Thank you.